Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. This is the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation's webinar series. This is our COVID-19 fifth webinar. We're talking today about vaccines and the hope on the horizon. So welcome, everybody. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. If you look at your control panel, you can type in questions during the session. We'll try and answer as many of those as we can. We're not going to be able to get to everybody, but we'll do our best. Look there also, there's a tab that says handouts. And if you look there, you can download the slides for today, as well as a couple of handouts that we put there for you. And we will have some polls that will pop up during the session that we would encourage you to participate in. And finally, at the end of our session today, we will a survey will pop up for feedback on this session that we've had. If you could please stay just for a couple of minutes and give us a little feedback. We will not be emailing a link to a survey after the fact. It will only pop up at the end of the session. So please give us that feedback there. I just want to, since we have a lot to cover and little time, I want to go ahead and get started. And I want to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Jesse Couk. He is with the Atlanta ID group. He works with me at Piedmont Healthcare and also next door at the Shepherd Center. So I'm very, very grateful to have Jesse here today. And we don't have any relevant financial disclosures, but we should tell you that both of us have been vaccinated, and we think you should be too. So without further ado, we're going to get on with the talk here with our first poll question. And get my link here, and we'll watch that for you. So the first question here today, have you received a COVID-19 vaccine? We'll give everybody a minute here to answer. You don't have to. Just to see who's awake. All right, I think we have the vast majority of people here. And we have about 80% having not yet received the vaccine, 20% roughly having been vaccinated already. So that's really great and encouraging. All right, Jesse, we're going to get started with our content here. I wanted to show this as we get started, since we're talking largely about vaccines. Some of you may have seen, I love this model of prevention as the Swiss cheese model. And not any specific layer is perfect. They all have imperfections or holes. But if we layer those together, then we can get pretty good protection. And if you see all the way to the right, immunization or vaccination is just one of those layers combined with all the others that keep us in our community safe. Jesse, your thoughts on this model?
I love this model. You know, I've been referring to the Swiss cheese model since our second wave appeared. And I think it's just really easy to imagine how, as the number of people that are infected increase, or in other words, if you were just to dump more viruses onto this, it becomes more challenging that you're stressing each of these layers. And it just goes to the point that every layer counts. Every step we can take to protect ourselves is important so that we don't get sick and the people that we care about don't get sick. And you know, the vaccine here should be seen as just another layer, especially right now when cases are higher than they've ever been before. Hopefully, the highest they'll ever be. At least this winter. And the vaccine, we should see that once you've had both shots, and it's been 2 weeks after your last shot, that's one very strong piece of Swiss cheese. It's not perfect. Some people will still get sick, but it's probably one of the strongest barriers we have there, and so important.
Excellent. And I think the one point is that just because it's not a perfect layer doesn't mean that we should throw it out, that it still can be very helpful. So we are going to spend the bulk of our time talking about vaccines and vaccine development for COVID-19. This is a really hot topic in both media and in my clinics. I'm sure yours too, Jesse. And that as a tool. I wanted to show this slide as just a demonstration of the fact that there are multiple types of vaccines, multiple ways of getting that immune response that are being developed right now against COVID-19. The first to have been successful are the mRNA vaccines, which are category 3 on this slide. But there will be others, and there are multiple in development right now, which is great news, because having different ways of getting at that is going to be really important. And if you joined us for one of our previous webinars, Dr. Eaton used vaccination, used a metaphor of a scarf as to help people understand vaccination. What she said was that, vaccines teach the body to recognize a feature. So if I always show up in a pink sweater, and you recognize me by my pink turtleneck, but somebody else has never met me before, how are you going to tell them to recognize me? Well, I may change my hair color, but I always wear a pink sweater. So they're going to recognize that they're going to learn that a pink sweater means that's Amy Case. And if you see her, we don't want her in the building, so kick her out if she shows up. So they see somebody come along with that pink sweater, and it's me, they're going to kick me out. It's not a perfect metaphor. Dr. Eaton used a scarf, but essentially it's teaching the body to recognize the virus on the basis of a feature of the virus. In this case, most often it is the spike protein that everybody has seen pictures of and can recognize. To be a little bit more specific, Jesse, can you talk a little bit about the mRNA type of vaccine, which is what's currently authorized and available in the U.S.?
Absolutely. I think these vaccines, the design is really impressive, because what's actually being put in your body is pretty simple. It's a piece of mRNA, which will be rapidly degraded, and they put it in a lipid envelope, which just helps it get into the cells. And I've had staff and patients express to me that they're anxious because the vaccine is new. But I think it's important to realize that yes, this is a new vaccine because the virus is new. But what's going into this vaccine actually was years in development. Over decades of knowledge went into this. The mRNA-based vaccine that we're receiving was actually designed several years ago for another coronavirus called MERS or MERS. It's a coronavirus with a 30% fatality rate. And the vaccine was designed not just because we needed something for that, but because the scientists who designed it, they had the foresight that they thought one day there probably is going to be a pandemic coronavirus. They didn't think it would be this soon, but they knew that we needed a vaccine, and they helped design this. And so all of the hard work to develop this, that all happened, before we even heard about SARS-CoV-2. So that when they found out about this virus in January, and we had the information for the virus, how the virus's RNA and how it encodes itself, they could figure out what they wanted to put in this envelope within an hour, and they had a product ready in February. They were doing animal studies then, and phase 1 trials were recruiting in March. So looking at this infographic, we have, you can see the blue envelope around a piece of messenger RNA. That RNA, it only has information to make the spike protein. The spike protein is, many are familiar with those spikes on the outside of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It doesn't code for virus. There's no virus. It doesn't cause a viral infection. The RNA degrades rapidly. It doesn't incorporate into your genome. It all goes away, and so all you're left with are just these viral spike proteins that your body's making antibodies against. And the design that's gone into this actually, you make a more robust antibody response against these spike proteins than you would if you had gotten infected with the virus itself. And so it's the reason that it's being used is that it would allow them to develop it rapidly, but also have just a very strong antibody response.
That's a great explanation. I wanted to say, like, if you think about the pink sweater or the red scarf analogy or metaphor, anyways, would you think that this maybe is like if the mRNA is like the knitting pattern that tells you how to make the red scarf or the pink sweater in my case?
It's like it tells the body how to make this so that the body's prepared to respond. Yeah, I think that's probably a good analogy.
Awesome. And I also wanted to say that in this infographic, it does say that no licensed vaccines use this technology. This is from an older article that predated the actual authorization of these mRNA vaccines. So these are being produced and given to patients now, both from the companies Pfizer and Moderna.
And Pfizer licensed the same sequence for that Moderna uses. So they're essentially, I don't think that one is better than the other. Yeah.
Additionally, you might hear some about viral vector vaccines. That this will probably be the next type of vaccine that is authorized in the United States. If we have our crystal balls up, the Johnson & Johnson data is expected probably sometime next week, and uses an adenovirus vector. But it's, Jesse, in general, not to get into the specifics, it's very similar in that it uses a virus to deliver this genetic material that then codes for another spike protein. Is that kind of how that happens?
Yeah, it's a very similar idea. There have been a number of trials over the years using this, and usually trying to just get over the hurdle of how do we get the body to make the protein? How do we get this protein in the body so that you can have an antibody response? And this is just another method other than the mRNA method. It's a little bit more complex because it involves an adenovirus that does not infect humans. And I think the important thing to realize is that if the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is approved, or eventually the AstraZeneca vaccine, that these vaccines, they don't cause infection. It's just a matter of trying to deliver the spike protein. We don't want your bodies to respond to the virus that this information is contained in. We want it to respond to the spike protein.
Excellent. So I've heard, Jesse, I don't know if you've heard this concern from people, but there are people that feel like, whoa, this was way too fast. It takes a long time to develop a new vaccine. And I feel concerned about trusting it because of how fast this happened. I feel like maybe they got a little fast and loose with the science or something. And is that something you've heard people worry about?
Yes, I think there are definitely people have expressed, as I discussed earlier, I feel like it came out so fast. Or I've had staff members say that they were told to wait until maybe a year from now so that we know more. And what I try to convey to them is that really the emphasis with any vaccine, and the emphasis here, was on safety, that we went through all the phase 1, 2, and 3 of trials. We just did it at an accelerated pace because I strongly believe this winter is going to be the worst one ever, that we will see improvement. There are better days ahead because of this vaccine. And so we need the vaccine now, and the sooner the better, but not without sacrificing safety. And I don't think that was done here. I don't think we did not sacrifice safety. I feel strongly this vaccine is safe.
I think that's a great point in terms of safety, but also efficacy. And I love this graph. I've shown it before in our webinars that it shows all the steps to, to development of the vaccine and how they generally one happens before and is completed. And then a lot of times there has to be additional funding, recruited before the next step can take place. And in this case, just given the global emergent nature of this, sorry guys, what we saw instead was that, well, sorry, got a little ahead of my skis. That what happened was that time got really shortened, but because because some of those steps took place concurrently, and then as Jesse said, in particular with the mRNA vaccines, the technology existed. It really just took putting the COVID, the SARS-CoV-2 information into that technology and then proving that it was effective, that rather than wait for the end of each phase of trial, the next phase was started, a bit of a gamble, because if phase 1 was a failure and we'd already started on phase 2, well, that's money lost, effort lost, but a gamble. And then similarly, in terms of the infrastructure and starting to manufacture those vaccines happening early, and concomitantly, another big gamble. But there was a lot of effort, a lot of brain power, and a lot of money thrown at this because of the global and emergent nature of it. And it really turned into a very effective mechanism. To me, it brings a lot of hope that it shows that, it's not necessarily that things have to take so long as people can get coordinated and work together and are funded well, that things can get done and get done a bit faster than we're used to. But I agree with you, Jesse. I think all the steps were there, and they were done and done appropriately. I've read, and I'm sure I know you have too, all of the data published and the FDA's review of the existing data, and I feel very confident in what's there. So I'm going to show a little bit of this data. Jesse, I'll ask you to maybe just orient us. This is a graph from the Pfizer phase 3 study.
So I think there's sort of a subgraph in this graph. I asked you to look at the larger one, the blue line on the top and the red on the bottom. Blue are people in the study who had the placebo, so they did not get the COVID-19 vaccine. And the red are those in the Pfizer study who received Pfizer's vaccine. Every blue square is somebody getting COVID-19. Every red circle is someone in the vaccine arm getting COVID-19. So you can see that they're both very similar, starting at day 0, really up until almost at about around day 10, 11. And what's happened here is that those are people who they already had COVID, they just didn't know it when they got the vaccine, and then they became sick. And then over time, you start to see the impact of the vaccine. And so by day 14, we start to see somewhere around 50% efficacy there. You can really, it's a stark difference. And then ultimately, 2 weeks after the second dose, we see 95% efficacy. You see very little red circles. There are some, but very little. This graph, it's rare that a science article or a graph just takes your breath away. But when I saw this, I had tears in my eyes because there's just so few things in medicine that are this effective. I wish everything worked as well as this vaccine. I think that the next graph that Dr. Case is going to show is going to be Moderna's vaccine. And what you'll see is it's very similar. The graphic is slightly different, but you can see where on the top in the black to gray are people in the placebo arm who every line in this case is somebody getting COVID-19, and then the blue are actually, I think that's time. I think every dot is time, so it's harder to see where each person is getting sick. But essentially, we have the same efficacy here. The scales are just slightly different, so the graphs look slightly different. But again, there are very few things in medicine that are this effective. This is incredible.
Are we back? Can you guys see now?
I can see
Are you
it.
able to see? All right, good. So my patients will tell you that sometimes I will draw on the butcher paper on the whiteboard in my office, and this is a pretty easy graph for me to draw. So I like this cartoon. Always try to get data that's good enough that you don't need to do statistics on it. It's very clear the efficacy here when you visualize the data. We don't yet have published data on the Johnson & Johnson vaccination. That's why we're not showing it here yet, because it hasn't been published or released in any public forum. And so right now, the recommendation, obviously, and what's authorized is for these two, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. But you know, there will be additional data as these other vaccines publish their phase 3 information, and hopefully, I mean, they look as good as these first two. I'm going to shift a little bit and talk to the sort of practical aspects of vaccination. One of those we hear a fair bit about, just because we're all being honest with one another, is side effects of the vaccine. And I'll start by saying that it's not unexpected that people will have some side effects. Jesse, do you want to talk about what people might expect and why that is?
Sure, yeah. So after you get your injection, you may think, as I did, wow, did I really get it? But within 3 to 6 hours after that, or even a couple hours after that injection, you'll start to develop arm pain as inflammation occurs, which is exactly what you want. Your body is making spike proteins just in that arm, not anywhere else. And you start to have an immune reaction. Your immune system is activating, and so that can mean arm pain, but also you may develop a headache. You may have chills and fatigue, muscle pain. And what I'm telling staff and patients is that don't get this at the beginning of a difficult shift. Try to schedule this when you know that you don't have a lot to do that evening and the next day. Just at least take that day off if you have to work. Don't plan on being very productive. And the second shot, the second injection, is more likely to elicit symptoms because now your body is primed and ready to have a reaction. And so we're seeing that you're more likely to have these symptoms with the second injection. And it's good. It just, when it's happening, just think that my body is getting ready so that it's prepared should I encounter the virus.
I think that's really important to make sure that people understand that these are possible and almost expected. I'll also say that I actually have had a few patients tell me, as well as colleagues tell me, that they really didn't have any side effects with their vaccine. So it doesn't mean that something was wrong. It just means that, you know, you were one of the people who really didn't have those side effects. And there were both in the clinical trials.
Yeah, many people don't
Jesse,
have. Sure, I should say,
yeah.
Many people don't have any reaction at all. And what we're saying is that there's a bit of a senior discount. So if you're 65 or older, you're less likely to have a reaction. And I think the same is likely true if you are immunocompromised. You're probably less likely to have as much inflammation, and so you may have less side effects.
Sure. This is a nice graph that our friend Jesse O'Shea put together, and just shows that there are similar, reactogenic side effects with both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and maybe a little bit more likely in the second dose. And certainly most commonly local discomfort at the site of the injection, which kind of makes sense. So, and then I liked this. Jesse, you want to give us what this is here?
Sure. Yeah, this is comparing the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines to a flu vaccine on your right and the Shingrix on the left. Shingrix is one of the best vaccines we have to prevent shingles. And I spend a lot of time counseling my patients. I've been giving Shingrix since it came out a few years ago. And it's one of the, Shingrix in particular is one of the vaccines that we have that's most reactogenic, where people are definitely reporting symptoms. And even with Shingrix, which, people are reporting side effects more common with that vaccine than compared to the COVID-19 vaccine. But even with Shingrix, about half my patients really aren't reporting much side effects. They'll tell me, Doc, you really talked up potential side effects, but I didn't really have anything. And then about 10% of my patients told me, I'm glad you said something because I did not feel right that evening or the next day. And that's with Shingrix.
I think this is a nice comparison because I feel like a lot of people maybe are worried about the side effects because we have talked a lot about that just to prepare people for what to expect. But a lot of people will readily get a flu vaccine and not worry too much about the side effects of that. And I feel like there was a lot of demand for the Shingrix. Maybe people weren't aware of the reactogenicity of it, but that I feel like they worry a little bit less about that, maybe just from the, it's sort of a mainstream idea, and the other two seem a little like new and scary. But the comparison here is an interesting thing to see. That they're similar.
Because of the side effects, I've had staff come to me whose parents have multiple health problems, and they express worry that, I don't know, they have so many health problems. I'm worried about giving them the vaccine because it could make them sick, or they're worried about, maybe they'll need to go to the hospital. And number one, we're really not seeing hospitalizations from these vaccines, even in people who have chronic health conditions. And if somebody you care about has chronic health conditions, that's somebody who needs this vaccine. And so those are reasons to get it. If you have heart failure, you're on dialysis, those are reasons to get the vaccine, not to avoid it.
Absolutely. I have heard concerns about severe allergic reactions, anaphylaxis, and so on. And the numbers, though we hear a lot about it in the news if you're paying attention, those numbers are exceptionally low for the millions of vaccines that have been given. So, and there is a recommendation to monitor people for some period of time after that they've had the vaccine, just to make sure that doesn't occur in the immediate period. So those types of severe types of reactions are really rare, and I think that's reassuring, even though a lot is made of them in headlines and things like that. So, I have heard a lot about when can I be vaccinated, and I will go ahead and couch this in. This is in the U.S. This is highly variable state to state. This is an example of the priorities in Massachusetts, and it may be different in the state where you live. And this is sort of beyond our scope to be able to talk to about each individual state. But the priorities generally are similar, but with some nuanced differences. Jesse, can you talk about a little bit about the in broad strokes, kind of the groups and the whys of that?
Sure. In terms of who we're vaccinating, the emphasis here in the U.S. Has been on healthcare workers because, we have been encountering people with COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. And that, I think that's a major reason why it was provided to healthcare workers first. And here in Georgia, we're also vaccinating people firefighters and police officers. And it's all based primarily on exposure. The other aspect of who you might want to vaccinate would be based on risk of hospitalization or worse. And so there we see people who are older. So we're vaccinating here in Georgia those over the age of 65 right now, and also people, and eventually, before we move on to the general public, we anticipate vaccinating those with high-risk health conditions, things like chronic lung disease, heart failure, end-stage renal disease, diabetes, morbid obesity, pregnancy, just people who are at highest risk for COVID-19.
Absolutely. And I think this does, we've had several questions about, if you're under 65, when, does pulmonary fibrosis, specific to our community, raise your risk and increase your level of priority in getting vaccinated? And yes, that again varies a bit state to state, but in general, people with high-risk medical conditions and pulmonary fibrosis would be included in that list, are on the list to be vaccinated, certainly before the general public. But the timing of that, the availability will vary depending on where you are. I did have a question from our listeners about how that's going to be decided, like how do you prove you have pulmonary fibrosis? And to be honest with you, I know, Jesse, I remember you saying the other day, it'll be a little bit hairy to try to figure that out. It's very clear how old somebody is, but their occupation or their medical conditions may require some sort of documentation, and that could be, that will probably vary locally and state by state as well.
That's a really good point. I think it's easy for us in our clinic when we're vaccinating, just beginning to vaccinate our patients, it's easy for us to pull up a list of everybody over the age of 65 and reach out and contact them. It's difficult to do that, to pull out that list based on their health condition. So if you have a high-risk health condition, I think it's important to be proactive, reach out to your doctor, get on, if you find out that you can get vaccinated in your state, reach out to others or other groups that are looking at trying to get the vaccine, to basically be an advocate for yourself to get the vaccine, because I think it will be hard otherwise to reach you individually based on a health condition.
I just wanted to throw these up, and these slides, like I said, are available for download. You can have these links. But the CDC does have a web page that links to a way to get to your state health department, which most states have a relatively comprehensive list. At least in Georgia, I know for sure has one that goes county by county for vaccine availability, and many of those have online sign-ons or will list the phone number to that facility. Then this MedPage Today is another list that is that's staying updated regularly. So those might be useful resources to you outside of others that you might be using. All right. So want to talk a little bit about sort of practically. We've talked about the data. We've talked about the science. We've talked about side effects and things like that. But then what? Like once you're vaccinated, I think most healthcare experts at this point feel like effective vaccines and actual vaccinations of our population will be the best and safest way for us to get this pandemic behind us. And I thought this cartoon was just very cute, because what am I going to do after I get vaccinated? I'm going to make a bunch of spike proteins and engulf them with dendritic cells and then display them to my T cells. And as my children say, because we made a comic strip about this together, then my B cells are going to get activated and say, hey, I know you, get out of here. So they feel like B cells are kind of superheroes. And throw out the bad guys. It's pretty cute. But so practically then what happens? Things are going to change really slowly. And Jesse mentioned this is as vaccination is a layer. It's not a perfect layer. It's a great layer. It's a very strong layer. But right now, while there is so much virus around and it is yet to be controlled, we still need to live as though most people aren't vaccinated and we aren't vaccinated, because many people aren't, and continue to do those safe practices like face coverings, mask wearing. I don't like the little guys with the little vents on their things, so just pretend you don't see those. We shouldn't be wearing those guys. Physical distancing, staying out of crowds and things like that. So, and we've talked a lot about those in our previous sessions, but those need to continue to be part of our lives for at least a little while longer, until we get to a place where many more people are vaccinated. So I wanted to get Jesse to talk a little bit about what herd immunity is, and maybe I'll start this over again and toss it to you, Jesse.
Sure. Yeah. I was going to say that with the masking, it's going to take a while before we get people vaccinated. And if you think about 95% efficacy, that's one person who got the vaccine for every 20 people who got the placebo. That sounds great. That is great. That's incredible. But right now, in some counties in Georgia, for example, and other places in the US, the circulating spread of virus is 20 times what I already consider to be a dangerous level of spread. And so with the amount of virus right now, it's really imperative that we do everything to prevent the spread. Plus, it's going to, as you'll see in the next graph, it's going to take a while before we get enough vaccinated to get herd immunity. And so it's so important right now, when many people don't have access to the vaccine, that we try to limit the spread to prevent as many people from being hospitalized or worse as possible while we get this vaccine. I think every time someone gets COVID-19, I just think about how that was preventable. And if we all do our part, we can limit the risk to ourselves and others while we wait for this to happen. You can go ahead and roll the animation there if you're able. So this shows if nobody's vaccinated, then it spreads like wildfire, right? That's really what we're seeing right early on and right now. Right now, we're not even at those 6 people getting immunized, and it still will spread like wildfire. You really need to get this closer to somewhere between 70 to 80% of people vaccinated to actually protect people. That's called herd immunity. You just decrease the risk of finding someone who's unvaccinated, and it will halt the spread of disease. We can get there. We have to help answer questions that people have, allow people to express their concerns and listen to them. I don't think it helps admonishing people if they're concerned about the vaccine. I think people really need to be heard, because just like the virus, everything's new. But if we can get vaccines to people, and if people are willing to get it, I think that we're going to have a much better, next winter is going to be much better.
All right, great, thank you. All right, so we have another poll question just to see if everybody is still awake. All right, so we had about 20% of our audience today having been vaccinated already. Now our next question is, maybe answer yes if you've already been vaccinated. Do you think you would want to be vaccinated against COVID-19? And no wrong answers here. I've had a lot of conversations about vaccines, a lot of them around how to get one as opposed to, concerns, but certainly those are valid. And I hope we've been able to address some of those at least so far. And we have a few questions we want to answer here in just a minute as well. Give you guys another couple of seconds here to get answers in. We have the vast majority of everybody. So we have about 80% voted, and the vast majority is ready and willing to be vaccinated. But we have a few people that have concerns, and that's okay. Ask questions, get your concerns answered, inform yourself, talk to your doctor, and hopefully we'll be able to address some of those as we continue to go. So we have a lot of questions that we have heard. Jesse and I have already been fielding. We had a few that were sent in ahead of time. We're going to try to get to, and we've sent. I know you guys have been typing those. Thank you in our questions and answers or our question tab here. And I think that we will answer a lot of these while we're going through these questions and answers. So hopefully we'll get to most of them, and if we don't, maybe we'll have some time for some additional. Jesse, I'm just going to ask you, because I got the expert here. Are there any reasons that a person should not get a COVID-19 vaccine?
So for the first shot, when you get the first shot of this particular vaccine, really there's pretty much no contraindication. People who have, the exception might be if somebody's severely ill. So some of our patients who are in the hospital severely ill shouldn't get vaccinated. But if you're chronically ill, or for example, I have a lot of patients who are on antibiotics who they've actually been offered the vaccine, and they may have had another doctor or someone say, oh no, wait till you're better. When I hear about that, I am just for it because really, if you're sick, if you're ill, you need this vaccine. So I'd say even if you're in the middle of treatment, you can talk to your doctor, but I would lean towards getting the vaccine unless you're severely ill. As far as who shouldn't get the vaccine for the second dose, if you have a severe allergic reaction consistent, so if you have difficulty breathing, throat swelling that happens after the vaccination, then you have something that we would call anaphylaxis. And in that case, you probably should wait and not get the second dose. It may be possible to consider another vaccine later on, but there'll be more information. So I would not get the second dose if you had anaphylaxis to the first shot. And then, Dr. Case, you put in here about allergic reaction to polyethylene glycol. This is part of the vaccine when they try to put it in that lipid particle to get it into the body. And we believe, we don't know for certain, but we believe that those who are having anaphylaxis, we think that it could be to that part of the vaccine, because everything else is really stuff that the body should be pretty familiar with. That's kind of the one thing in there that's kind of that could be foreign, that people could have been exposed to before.
And let me ask you this: is the polyethylene glycol issue specific to the mRNA vaccines, the ones that are currently authorized?
I believe so. I haven't seen because there haven't been FDA EUAs, emergency authorizations yet for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I don't know if that's going to be in other vaccines as well, but probably something that we'll all be looking at when that's published.
Okay.
But there will be other vaccines in the future.
Right, and so I think that's a good point, is that we'll probably learn more later, but severe allergic reaction to one vaccine doesn't necessarily predict to a different one if there's a different carrier or something like that. So that doesn't mean you can't have one in the future, or if you have reaction to a different type of vaccine, it just means that the monitoring period for that is a little bit longer.
Yeah, but the Moderna and Pfizer are so similar that I would not switch from one to the other if you had a severe reaction.
Right. Yes, with my crystal ball, I mean other types of vaccines.
Yes.
Okay, great. Now this comes up. Somebody asked me this today. Which one should I go get? Is one better than the other? Presuming right now we have the two, because we don't have published data on any of the others at the moment. But in the U.S., there is Moderna and there is Pfizer. And should I try to get one instead of the other? One said 95%, the other I think 94% efficacy.
Yeah, the spread is the worst it's ever been. So the sooner you get that vaccine into your arm, the better. So the best vaccine is the one that you can get now. I received Pfizer. My wife is a healthcare worker. She received Moderna. From my perspective, it's Pepsi versus Coke. They're pretty similar. I think the efficacy is probably pretty similar, and within what we would consider statistical error. I think they're probably equally efficacicious.
Don't say Pepsi and Coke in Atlanta though, Jesse, because that could get you into a lot of trouble.
Everybody knows. Everybody knows
it's all Coke. But that's a good point. So I've said this several times. Just take whichever one is offered. Get the same one. The second shot should be ideally the same, however. So try not to mix your vaccines, and that's something that I think most places that are giving it are not doing that.
Yeah, you can't swap it. Right now, the recommendation is you cannot swap one for the other.
We've had several of these flavor questions in our question box, and so I'm glad we anticipated this. Can I take the vaccine if I'm immunosuppressed or have an autoimmune disease? And maybe let's take the immunosuppression issue first. Jesse, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so I think it's a great question. The reality is, again, if you're immunocompromised, you need this vaccine. In most cases, you can't safely stop your immunosuppression. You're on it for a reason, and you could be harmed if you stopped your immunosuppression. If you're going to be on immunosuppression in the future, it's ideal to get vaccinated before that started, but I wouldn't necessarily wait. I wouldn't compromise your own underlying condition by waiting or stopping the immunosuppression. We do know that vaccines are effective in people who are immunocompromised. The stronger the immunosuppression, especially that immunosuppression that's directed against B cells and T cells, those tend to be a little bit, have a bigger impact on whether vaccines are effective. But again, something is better than nothing. Right now, we don't have any existing immunity to these viruses. So if you get vaccinated, even if you're immunocompromised, you'll have a little bit of a response, if not a whole response, if not an equivalent response, and that's better than nothing.
Good point. And so you sort of alluded to this, but should a patient on immunosuppressant drugs stop their medications before or after they are vaccinated? I think you just said you wouldn't advise that.
No, not unless you're supposed to stop it for other reasons.
And I will also mention that specific to transplant patients, there is a study that's being conducted. I know I think it's at Brigham and also at Piedmont, actually, where we work, looking at the Pfizer, specific to the Pfizer vaccine. I know are those two sites, but studying that specifically in transplant patients and their response, just to quantify that. Although I don't think it would necessarily change the recommendation to get some level of immunity in that patient population. Another question that we have is, do we worry about patients with autoimmune disease, or similarly, in a similar vein, patients who have had transplants and the vaccine causing a rejection or an autoimmune flare?
Yeah, and I think you weigh the potential risk, which is theoretical, and we're not seeing this vaccine increase risk of rejection or autoimmune flares. But you weigh that unknown risk and something that we're not seeing versus the very real risk of getting COVID-19 and all of the potential problems from that. And I think it's pretty clear the vaccine is going to be the best thing to get, especially now when spread is the worst it's ever been.
Absolutely. And I guess, Jesse, is that something that we worry about with other types of vaccines? It's not something I'm really aware of particular to autoimmune lung disease or in lung transplant patients.
No.
I like that short answer. All right, another question here that I think we've had some around this area. Maybe I can ask a few different ways. Can the vaccine cause or worsen pulmonary fibrosis? And I will go back and say, and let me ask you, Jesse, I didn't say that I was going to ask you this question, but is the causing pulmonary fibrosis or worsening pulmonary fibrosis something that you are aware of with other types of vaccines for respiratory viruses or otherwise?
No, and I think probably this is a good point to convey that just again, this vaccine is not a live virus, which is why we recommend it to people who are immunocompromised. It doesn't cause COVID-19 infections. You don't get a positive test from the vaccine. There are definitely people who are vaccinated and will test positive, and it's just because they actually encountered the real virus or they were already incubating it. And so any lung conditions that were caused would be from the virus itself, not from the vaccine. So no, we don't see this.
So specific to the COVID-19 vaccine, this is not something that was reported. There were patients with chronic lung conditions included in the clinical trials, although they did not specifically include those on significant immunosuppression, but those with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis or others that were not on immunosuppressive regimens were included, although in small numbers. And as far as adverse events, worsening pulmonary fibrosis was not reported, and nor did I see any emergence of pulmonary fibrosis when I looked, specifically at those data from related to the vaccine. So I'll also try to put this in context. And the PFF has a statement out that we put out a couple of weeks ago talking about vaccines, I think the statement is in your handouts. If you want to go and read it there. But when we talk about the impact of COVID-19, the disease, the virus and infection with the virus on patients with pulmonary fibrosis, the outcomes are worse than the general public. So, and if hospitalized, worsening lung function and severe illness, critical illness, and mortality are much more common in patients with chronic lung disease, including pulmonary fibrosis, than in the general population. So it's a very high-risk scenario for for pulmonary fibrosis patients to get COVID-19, where we don't have evidence of that with the vaccine. And as Jesse pointed out, it's not a whole virus. It cannot give you the disease. It's just a characteristic piece of the virus itself. So your body learns to defend you from it. And although the CDC is gathering data, be safe if you've gotten vaccinated or do. I encourage you to sign up for the Be Safe program, where they're tracking safety and adverse events in people who get vaccinated from here going forward, and share that data. But that's not something that, just in terms of magnitude as well as what we currently know, we are very worried about. I also had a couple of questions here about whether one vaccine or another is more suitable for ILD patients. We don't have information on that right now. The two available vaccines in the United States are so very similar that again, if it's offered, that's the one closest to your arm is the one that should go into it. And we just don't have data to support one over the other in that type of scenario. Let's see. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. This is about timing, and I've had this come up too. If we've heard there are some supply issues and distribution issues in different places, some are handling it better than others from a state-to-state standpoint. So Jesse, if it comes up, is it okay to get my second shot later than is recommended?
Right. So, ideally you get your shot on time, and I think every effort should be made to get that second shot on time and not have it be given earlier or later. The reality is that I think that we've all seen a number of challenges with both getting vaccine delivered to states at the manufacturing level, and then trying to get the significant number of staff to try to vaccinate this into people's arms while also following all of our COVID-19 precautions. So, and using a workforce that's already under a significant amount of strain for a pandemic that here in Georgia is the worst it's ever been. There will be some challenges, and it is quite possible that the second dose could be given late. And so right now the CDC has stated, based on the data that they've looked at, that the second dose could be scheduled for up to 6 weeks. It doesn't mean that it should be given at 6 weeks, but if it's given within that time frame, they won't be recommending another series later on. And if something happens and it's given after that time, I think we'll probably expect more recommendations later on what to do. But hopefully 6 weeks is a very reasonable amount of time to try to figure out how to get that second dose.
And aside from logistics, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why someone might want to delay their second vaccine dose. And Jesse, you alluded to this a bit earlier, but people with acute illness, including COVID-19, should kind of wait until after they're recovered. But they can still get their shots for COVID-19 just after recovery. We still recommend that. And people with chronic diseases, you alluded to this too, if the symptoms are stable, those patients should be able to receive both doses of their vaccine. But if they're flared, they may want to give themselves time to get back under control if it's going to be a brief period of time, although remembering and keeping in balance and potentially talking with your physician about weighing the risk and benefit of going ahead with that dose versus waiting until that acute illness has subsided. But in general, perhaps pushing out a little bit if there is a significant acute illness to wait on. You mentioned this, Jesse, a little bit, but the issue of booster shot or yearly vaccine, and this kind of falls into the length of time that vaccinated people will be immune. I think some of that is just not known yet.
Yeah, it takes time to figure this out. I get this question every time I go to a ward and talk to our staff about the vaccine. An inevitable question is, are we going to get this every year like we get the flu shot? And the reality is that we are still learning because the vaccine, people haven't been vaccinated for over a year yet. I'm hopeful that we won't need to get vaccinated every year. But it's hard to say if there will be a need for a booster. You may have seen talk in the media about potential mutations. Fortunately, the vaccine itself provides us with very robust immunity that appears to be effective against the variants that we're seeing thus far. But Moderna, for example, is working on a potential vaccine that could be used as a booster against some of these variants that can evade the immune system in people who have had COVID-19 itself, not because they will be given, but because these are scientists who they want to have something ready. They don't want to be caught on their laurels. We need to do things early to be prepared. It's better to do a lot of work and be prepared as opposed to, and then not have to use it as opposed to not be ready for something.
Great. And I will say that just quickly, we're running a little short on time, but there's a few other issues I do want to get to because there's been questions. The COVID vaccine cannot cause your nasal swab, nasopharyngeal swab, or saliva test to be positive. It does not cause infection. It can potentially, depending on the type of antibody test that's been done, cause your antibody test to be positive. That's true, yeah, Jesse?
Yes, so most of the antibodies that look for spike proteins, those will convert to positive. Some antibody tests don't look for spike proteins, so those wouldn't turn positive. And so just because you get an antibody test after your vaccine and it's not positive, see what they're testing for, because it may not be the spike protein. And I just think it's important to convey, if your nasal swab or your oral swab tests positive, that means that you got COVID, unfortunately. And we're seeing that more than I'd like to, just because spread is so bad. So, but the vaccine did not make the test positive. That was COVID-19.
And I'll quickly say, some questions about when can we get back to normal? When can I see my grandkids? When can I go to a restaurant? When can I travel? When can I? Well, this is part of a risk reduction strategy. We'll just go back to that Swiss cheese model and say that right now there is a ton of virus around. And so we need to continue our current adherence to guidelines and safety. And then anything that you do, consider it in context of your risk budget. Does the balance work out, and is it within that risk budget for you? And we've talked about that concept some before. I did want to have just a word quickly, because I know we are a little bit over time, but since we have an infectious disease expert with us, a word about variants, because we are hearing a lot about that in the news right now. Jesse, can you talk a little bit about what we are hearing, what we know about these variants?
Yeah, the primary variant we're discussing right now is the B117 variant that you sometimes hear about as the UK strain or the UK variant. This variant appears to be better at transmitting from one transmissibility, so going from one person to another. And if what we saw in the UK applies to the US, if it's much stronger at going from person to person than our own variants that are circulating here in the US, it's expected to become the dominant variant by March, and could potentially lead to a fourth wave, if you will, particularly if we let down our guard. And I think the important thing to realize about variants is that they will occur the more we allow spread to happen. So it underlies the importance of just trying to do everything we can to avoid spread. A couple more things. The vaccine does appear to be very effective against that variant, the South African variant, which could, there have been worry about that it makes the vaccine less effective. The vaccine is still considered efficacious against that strain based on the studies that we've shown so far.
Great, thank you. So as we wrap up, because we are a little bit over time, and thank you guys for staying with us, I wanted to remind everybody about our PFF COVID-19 resources. They're there on our website, very easy to find. We've got some handouts there that you can download from this session, but there are lots of others to see. If you would like to go back and watch this webinar, it'll be posted to our YouTube page shortly, maybe in a few days. And I just wanted to say, from final thoughts, do not throw away your shot. If you get an opportunity, take it. And if you make an appointment and for some reason can't make it, make sure you cancel and let somebody else have that opportunity, because we don't want to throw away any of these precious shots. The other thing I'll say is wait for it. It is worth it. And we have to have patience. The effort has been great, but it has been challenging, and we have to accept that and know that we will all get the vaccine if we want it, and it'll come. But try to be patient. I try to work in a Hamilton reference anytime I want. We've gone through as many questions as we can, but if there's some we didn't get to, we will try to get back to you afterwards. And please do remember that as we end this session, there will be a brief feedback request. So please stay on and give us that feedback. And thank you so much, Dr. Couk, Jesse, for being with us today. I really, really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule and joining us for this. I know our community has benefited from it. And thank you, all of our attendees who were able to join us today as well. I hope you learned a lot and got hopefully some of your questions answered. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Jesse.
My pleasure.